this computer. How I hit. All right, good evening, everyone. Tonight's shiur, Elul Nishma Avi Maridover, Mered Nuran Halevi, Imi Marati Rachel Barav Michael, and this week we are talking about parshat Ki Taytsay. This parsha happens to have more mitzvot in it than any other parsha in the Torah, so it's always challenging to figure out, okay, what do you talk about? Because I can't say there's a theme to the parsha because there really isn't, other than we got lots of mitzvot, one after the other, and so I decided we're going to talk tonight about the different nations that surround Eretz Yisrael and what HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us about them. So we're in Devarim Perek Chav Gimel. We're going to talk basically about one very small section that has about 6 psukim in it, 7 psukim in it, that talks about a number of different nations. So we'll start with psukim themselves, which begin with Lo Yavo Ammoni Umoavi Bikahal Hashem, Gamdor Asiri Lo Yavo Lahem Bikahal Hashem Ad Olam. And Ammonites and Moabites are not allowed to enter the Kahal of Hashem. We'll see what that means. Even the 10th generation are not allowed to enter the congregation of Hashem Ad Olam through eternity. And the Torah gives a reason. It says, Al Dvar Asher Lo Kidmu Etchem Balechem Uvamayim. The reason that the Torah seemingly appoints this rather harsh requirement on Ammonites and Moabites is because they did not Kidmu Etchem Balechem. They did not come out and greet you with bread and water when you were on the way leaving Egypt. Va'asher Sachar Alecha Bilam ben Ba'arim, because they hired upon you Bilam the son of Ba'arim, Yiptar Aram Naraim, who came from Ptor and Aram Naraim Lekalaleka, to curse you. However, Hashem did not want to listen to Bilam. Hashem turned this bracha, this klala, into a bracha. Because Hashem loves you. Lo tidrosh shlomam v'tovatam. You should not seek their peace or their goodness. Kol yamachal yalam, for your all of eternity, basically. And then we are told, Lo titayv adomi. You should not hate an Edomite, ki achichu, because he's your brother. Lo titayv mitzri. You should not hate, detest an Egyptian, ki kier hayita bi'artzo, for you were a sojourner in his land. Banim asher yivoldu lehem dor shlishi, after a child has been born for them into the 3rd generation, yavol lehem mikal Hashem, he is allowed to enter the congregation of Hashem. So we're going to try to go through these, understand what all these are about, why we seem to have different results from different events historically. So the first question, of course, that we have to try to understand is, who are all these people and what are they? Where are they from? Obviously, the only one that seems what we will say intuitive is Mitzri. Mitzri is an Egyptian. We understand what an Egyptian is. Ammoni, Moavi, Edomi, those are nations, or not necessarily geographic areas, but those are more families that have become nations. So very briefly, where they all come from, we go back to Bereshit, Perek Yutet, and we find that Ammon and Moab, these two nations who are forbidden to, whatever that means, they're forbidden to Lavo Bikal Hashem, we are the two nations that are descended from Lot, as we find Vataren Shnei Bnot Lot, Me'avihen, the 2 daughters of Lot. They were in their cave with their father after they ran away from the destruction of Sodom, and they each had a son. One, the Bechira, the older one, had a son, and she called his name Moab, who was the father of Moab until this day. The younger one had a son, and she called his name Ben Ami, and he is the ancestor of the nation called Ammon to this very day. So, if we go back to those 2 nations of Ammon and Moab, they are both descended from Lot, and one from each of his daughters. So those are where those come from. We don't, Edom, I didn't bring down the psukim. Edom is the nation that's descended from Esav, and obviously Mitzrayim are the people that dwell in Egypt. So we have these 4 different nations who have restrictions upon entering the Kahal of Hashem, which basically means conversion and marrying into the Jewish people. Now, if we go back to each of these, if we go back to again the Torah describes the reason why we are not allowed to have Ammonites and Moabites enter the congregation is because they did not come out to greet us with lechem and mayim, with bread and water, when we were traveling through or around their nation, their territories on the way to Eretz Yisrael from leaving Egypt. So I want to go back to Dvarim where we see all of the actual travels. Moshe, in the beginning of Sefer Dvarim, the beginning of his farewell speech, he gave a whole history of the Jews traveling through the desert from Mitzrayim to get to Eretz Yisrael. And he tells us the following, basically, that firstly, we are entering near the boundary of Esav. Hayoshim b'Seir, who live in Seir, and you got to be careful. We're not to start up war with them. Now, interestingly, it says, Ochel tishburi beitam b'kesef achaltem. If you want to get food from Edom, you have to buy it, and then you can eat. And you're allowed to buy food from them. So we see that when it came to Edom, there is no expectation that they were going to come out and bring us food. The expectation is very simply, you have to go and buy food from them if you want to eat. Now then we pass through Esav, then we get to Moab, and when we pass through Moab, doesn't say anything about food here. It gives a whole history about how Ammon and Moab inherited their lands from different other tribes and nations, and we get a whole story. And then finally we get to Sichon, and when it gets to Sichon, it says that before they got to Sichon, it says that Moshe sends a delegation of messengers to Sichon, and here's what he tells them. He tells them, I want to pass through your land, I'd like to pass through on the main highway. Lo asur yamin small, we won't go and float off and stop on the way. We're going to just pass right through on the highway. That's it. We just want to drive through quickly. That's it. Food, you want to give me food? I'll buy food. You can sell me food so I can eat. And when you give me water, I'll pay you for the water and a drink. I'm not asking you for any special gifts, whatever. Just let me pass through. That's all I'm asking you. Safe transit, going straight on the highway. That's it. But then Moshe adds a very interesting pasuk. Kasher asu li b'nei Esav, as the children of Esav did for me, Hayoshim b'Seir, v'Moavim Hayoshim ba'Ar, and the Moabites who live in Ar, they did this stuff for me. Ad asher avaret hayardain, until I crossed the Jordan, el aretz asher Hashem lokeinu notein lanu. Now Sichon doesn't want to go, but again, interestingly enough, Moshe references that the children of Esav and the children of Moab allowed them something. Whether they allowed them to buy food or they allowed them to pass through is going to be a discussion among the parshanim. But the consensus seems to be that, again, if you look back at Esav, that they bought food from Esav. There's nowhere where it specifically mentions that they bought food or had any dealings with the Moabites. But clearly, there seems to be a contradiction here between what was provided, what was expected, and what the expectations were. And that's what we talked about in our verse, what our parsha talks about, and Moshe mentioned the Devarim. Okay, we're going to go digress for one more minute to our first contact with a Moabite who wants to convert. First time we have a Moabite who wants to convert, of course, none other than Ruth. Okay? And of course, we know the story of Ruth. And interestingly enough, when we get to the story of Boaz, Boaz says to the other person, this Ploni Almoni, who he says to him, I want you to know, you're going to buy Naomi's field, but also you were also the condition of buying and redeeming the field is that you have to take Ruth as your wife. And the Goel says, Lo uchali gali, I am not able to penashchidet nachalati, because by doing so, I will destroy my inheritance. You redeem it because I'm not able to. And ultimately Boaz does. And it says, I've acquired Ruth to be my wife, to establish the name of the the dead husband on his inheritance. So the dead soul should not be cut off from his people, he who died without children. He says, you're witnesses. Now it's interesting because if we look at this dialogue, the Goel says, Lo chalig ali, I'm not allowed to redeem this. Why? Pen ashchit et nachalati. Why was he? What was his concern that his inheritance was going to be destroyed? Now, there are a number of thoughts among the Parshanim. One says, very simply, he didn't want to bring a new wife in. He had enough wives. He didn't want any more wives. Didn't need any more. I have a full family, full house full of kids and wives. Don't need any more wives. That's why he said, I will water down my inheritance if I have more kids. Enough. And one opinion. The other opinion says exactly the opposite. That his reason for refusing was because he said, wait a minute, she's a Moabite. She can't convert anyway. Why would I want to marry somebody who is not allowed to convert? That's another school. Then there's another school that says exactly the opposite from that. That no, in reality, he didn't know what the halacha was. Nobody knew what the halacha was because, remember, this story happens, let's say it's 100, 200, 300 years since they've left Mitzrayim. The Moabites weren't knocking down the door to convert. So nobody, unless they happened to study this halacha, nobody knew that there was anything different about this halacha than any other halacha, that Moabites, males and females, were both forbidden. Even though we know today, everybody knows today, because of the story of Ruth, that it's only the males that are forbidden. But seemingly at Boaz's time, it clearly was not noted. And therefore, the Goel says to Boaz, who happens to be a leader of the town, he says, look, if I do it, I'm a nobody. Everybody's going to say, you didn't know the halacha, you made a mistake. You, Boaz, if you do it, people will say, oh, he knew that, he must know the halacha, then there must be some dispensation here. Maybe that way we'll get the halacha straightened out. So there's a lot of questions going on. And those questions, by the way, don't end with Ruth. Okay, we're going to now go to the Gemara in Yevamot, which tells us that, by the way, this story keeps going. This question of whether Ammon and Moab. The Gemara in Masechet Yevamot tells us the following halacha. First, the Mishnah. The Mishnah says very simply, clearly, Ammoni uMoavi. And Ammonite and Moabite Asurim. They are forbidden to convert and marry a Jewish person. Bisuran Isur Olam. And that is a permanent deferment. There's no getting away from it. A person who is from Ammon or Moab, forbidden forever. Aval. This is only the males, because Nikevoteim Mutarot Miyad. A Moabite or Ammonite woman is allowed to convert. Doesn't have to wait. We saw before that in the case of an Egyptian or an Edomite, they have to wait 3 generations, according to one opinion. That applies also to the males, and that's what the Mishnah is now going to say. Mitzri v'Adomi. In the case of a Mitzri or an Adomi, einam asurim eload shlosh darot. There are only 3 generations that they're forbidden. Echad zacharim v'echad nikevod. Both males and females have to wait. There's a waiting period. In other words, if I, as an Egyptian, want to convert, I can. But my grandson would be able to convert, assuming he found a like-minded, assuming my child, I found a like-minded Egyptian woman who wanted to convert and was able to have a child, and then that child found a like-minded child, somebody whose parents also had converted. When you get to the 3rd generation, then they can be full converts. Rabbi Shimon, however, Matrit and Kevot Miyad. Rabbi Shimon says that the female Mitzrayim and Edomim are also allowed to convert immediately, and he proves that from the fact that Ammon and Moab, he says a Kal V'chomer, and they accept them. Okay, now the Gemara asks, how do we know that there is a distinction in the Edomites and in the Ammonites and Moabites between the males and the females? Where do we get this idea from? The Torah doesn't say anything about a distinction between males and females. Why should there be a difference? Gershon. Question. Gershon's comment is traditionally the men or women always went by the faith of the husband. Therefore, she would, if she married the husband, she would join the husband's tribe and automatically, regardless. Okay, that's one possibility. But there's nowhere in the Torah that it gives us any inclination, or at least doesn't seem to be, at least that's Gemara's comment, is where do we see that the Torah, forget what normal dictate is and normal practice is, where does the Torah give us a hint or an allusion to the fact that there's a difference between the males and the females. Now, I would have expected the Gemara's answer would have said, oh, there's a pasuk that says such and such, but the Gemara doesn't. The Gemara is going to give us a whole long story. Okay, now the story takes place in the time of Shaul and David. Now, we're all familiar with the story. It's the story of this guy named Goliath, who comes out from the Philistine camp and taunts the Jews and says, come on, send somebody to fight me, you cowards, come on. And he does this for 40 straight days, and nobody wants to come out and fight against him. And David's 3 brothers are in the army, and he comes bringing a care package from his father to his brothers. And he hears this guy, and he says, who does this guy think he is? That he can come and say, nobody's going to fight him. I'll go out and fight him. Now, of course, words gets to show that this little kid, well, he's not quite a kid, but okay, wants to go and fight him. And ultimately, he does go out and fight him. But in the middle of this story, there's a whole lot going on. Now, we also have to understand this is one of the strangest stories, primarily because of its juxtaposition to 2 stories that happened right before it in the Navi Shmuel. The stories that happened right before it in Shmuel is that Shmuel is told to anoint a new king because Shaul's made a few mistakes and he's not going to continue as king. God says, I've had it with Shaul, time to anoint a new king. And Shmuel goes and anoints none other than David to be the next king. Nobody knows about it except David and his immediate family and Shmuel. Now, immediately after that, we're told that Shaul starts having irrational behavior. And his officers suggest that he should find a musician who will calm him down when he has these bouts of irrational behavior. And who do they find? And who do they suggest? None other than this gentleman who plays a mean tenor, whether that's a violin or it's a viola or a guitar or whatever, some type of stringed instrument. And David comes and plays before him. Okay? So now, after that, David has gone home because they're at war. Shaul is not in the palace having fits. There's a war going on, and David goes back home. But his father sends him, as we said, to bring care package to the brothers, and he hears this going on. Now, in the middle of this story, it says, so Shaul is watching. David comes by, he says, I'll fight him. Shaul says, by the way, okay, well, you can't go fight him. You're not wearing armor. What do you got? You got to put some armor on it. Shaul gives him his armor, and magically it fits him. David says, no, I don't want the armor. I'm going out to fight. I don't need armor. Hashem's with me. I don't need the armor. But remember, it fit him. So you got to, okay? Hero Shaul at David. When Shaul watches David go out to fight the police, he goes to his chief of staff, Avner. He says, Ben Miza Anar, Avner. Says, Avner, whose son is this kid? Vayomer Avner, and Avner says, you know what? I don't know. Now, how can that be? We know that David has been the court musician. What do you mean he doesn't know who he is? Lo Yadale, he didn't recognize him. Shaul himself knew who he was. V'akativ, the verse we read last chapter after he came as the musician, Shaul likes him very much, and he becomes, a part of Shaul's entourage. Ella, so what is he asking Avner? Ahavua Kamashil. He was asking Avner, wait a minute, who's his father? Let's find out who his father from. What's his yichus? Where does he come from? Wait a minute, he didn't know who his father was? We read earlier, this father of David, Bimei Shaul Zakein, was old in Shaul's life, but he was known. Everybody knew who he was. And Rav said, Yishai Avi David. This was referring to Yishai. It was David's father. He had an entourage that followed him. He was not an unknown personage. He was well known. He had all these wonderful sons who were all the oldest 3 in the army. Everybody knew Yishai. He was a well-known personage around his neighborhood and I guess around the country. So so the Gemara says, no, you don't understand. Shaul wasn't asking who is his father. He wants to know, wait a minute, where is his father? What family is he from? Imi Peretz Asi, Imi Zerach Asi. I know he's from the tribe of Yehuda, but I got to know which of Yehuda's 2 twin sons is which family is coming. Does he come from the Peretz side of the family or the Zerach side of the family? Why is that important? Because Imi Peretz Ati, if he comes from Peretz, Malka Have. this kid is going to be the king. Because the king is allowed to parrots to break down boundaries, and you can't question him. But if this Yishai is from Zerach side of the family, okay, he'll be an important guy. He may make it to chief of staff or prime minister, but he's never going to be king. My time, so why did he ask all of a sudden who David was? He's been playing music before him. He knows who he is. Why? Because he was worried. Suddenly he got nervous. That when Shaul dressed David in his uniform, it fit him. How could that possibly be? We just read about Shaul when he was anointed. He was the tallest guy in the whole force. He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. So how could his uniform fit David perfectly? Doesn't make sense. He said, something's going on fishy here. So this is the discussion they're having. Who is this David? Where is he from? What's he all about? But then in the middle, somebody else pops up and says, wait a minute. Doeg says, wait a minute. Before you ask whether he's suitable as the king or not, first ask if he's even able to be Jewish. Why? My time? What do you mean? How can he not be Jewish? He's a descendant of a Moabite. How can he even be Jewish? He wasn't allowed to convert. That was an illegal conversion. All those kids aren't really Jewish. So Avner says, no. He says to Doeg, wait a minute. You can't trap me on this one. Tanina, we've learned. I was studying in the Beit Medrash once upon a time. We always learned. That was what we always learned when we learned this pasuk of Lo Yavo B'Kal Hashem. It was always Ammoni v'lo Ammoni, the males and not the females. Moavi v'lo Moavi. That's what the Torah specifically says. So wait a minute. So Doeg says, wait a minute. Is that the case? Ela me'ata mamzer v'lo mamzeret. You want to tell me that the verse before, which tells me that mamzer, somebody who's born from a marriage that is halachically illegal and carries a punishment of karet or more, is a child of that is also allowed to marry a Jew, a female? Mamzer kativ. It only says, so he says, no, it's mamzer, mumzar, that the mamzer is definitely not allowed to, males and females. There's no difference. Then Doeg asks him, well, what about a mitzvah? You're going to tell me that Egyptian mitzvah below mitzvah that doesn't apply to the Egyptian females? So the Gemara, Avner answered, Mishani Hacha, no, it's all different. Why are Ammon and Moab singled out specifically that the females are different than the males, which does not exist in all the others, except according to Reb Shimon, which does by mitzvah, but that's not the point. Why? Because the Torah specifically tells us why the Ammonites and Moabites are excluded. Why? Because they didn't come out to greet you with food and water when you were traveling from Egypt. Darko shel Adam lekadem. That's the job of the males. The males have the job. They should have come out as servants, brought food. The women don't come out and bring food. You want to eat food from a woman, you got to wait till she serves it in the house. She doesn't come out and serve it out in public. Only the male is supposed to come out. So therefore, since the Torah specifically gives us this reason of the fact that they didn't bring food, that's to tell us that there's a difference between the males and the females. So Doeg says, no, that's not a good reason. What do you mean? The male should have brought the men food and the female should have brought the ladies food. What do you mean? The men couldn't bring food to the ladies couldn't bring food to the men. I understand, but the male Moabites and Ammonites should have brought food to the Jewish males, and the female Moabites and Ammonites should have brought food to the females. Ishtik. Avner did not have an answer for this. He was silenced. Miyad. Now, immediately, Shaul says, wait a minute. Let's get this clarified. Vayomer HaMelech, she'ala ta bein meizeha elem. Whose son go? He says to Avner, go and find out whose son this Elem is. Now, why does he suddenly use him in Elem? Elem is another word for a young man. But up until now, he's been a nar. He's been called the nar, the young man. Again, there are two words, but one of them has a very slightly different connotation. Hatam karle nar, v'hacha karle Elem. Why does he call him Elem? Hachi kamarle. This is what he was telling Avner. Halacha nit alma mimcha. we've forgotten the halacha. From ela meaning hidden, something is hidden. Who is this? Why is this halacha about whether he is allowed to be converted or not? He's been hidden from us. Say usha'al b'beit hamedrash. Go find the Sanhedrin. Let's go ask. Let's get this clarified once and for all. Sha'al. So he asked. Amrulay, they answered him. Ammonites Moabites. Obviously, because that's the halacha. They knew that halacha. Again, it had rarely come into practice because, as I said, there weren't Ammonites and Moabites banging down the door to convert. So it happened once in history. And again, remember, we're now 3-4 generations from Ruth. And again, it's been forgotten. Actually, little dog at Kohani Kushiata. But again, what happened? Doeg goes to the Beit Midrash with them and has the same conversation with the guys at the Beit Midrash. And again, he's Tiku, and they can't refute his arguments. They were about to announce that the halacha is mistaken, that he can't be, that Ammonites Moabites is a mistaken halacha. Miyad, immediately, Vamasa ben Ishu Tmo Yitzra Yisraeli Asherba Laviga Bat Nochosh Tiv Yeter Yishmaeli. This guy Amasa, who is the son of Yeter, comes forward and he says the following. But it's interesting because how does the Gemara describe him? In one place, he's described as the son of Yeter, who is Yisrael. Another place, he's described as the son of Yeter, who is Ishmaelite. Why was he called a Ishmaelite if he's Jewish? Rava says the reason he's called the son of an Ishmaelite is he pulled out his sword like an Ishmaelite. The Amar. I will kill with this sword that I just pulled out anybody who wants to dispute this halacha, that's a traditional halacha. This is the way the halacha was learned in Shmuel's Betin. That's it. That's the halacha. Don't ask me questions. You can't ask questions. That's the halacha. Now the Gemara has a very interesting comment. So that's where we go. So this, by the way, is the answer to the Gemara's original question. Where do we see this halacha from? This whole dialogue is based on this halacha that was promulgated, that's Ammoni and does not apply to females, and Moavi does not apply to females, only to the males. Umi meheman, how can he have been believed? Wait a minute. Gemara says, wait a minute. We have a general principle. Rav Abba bar Rav. Rav Abba said the name of Rav. Kol Talmid Chacham Shemora Halacha Uba. Anybody who says, this is the halacha, I learned it, it's a tradition, this is the halacha, and then he comes and says this in the Beit Midrash, if he says it before this comes up as a practical halachic question, Shalom Lo, we can believe him that he has this tradition. The Mlav ain't Shalom Lo. But if not, we don't listen to him. So how could we have listened to Amasa, who said, this is the traditional teaching I have? That's only if he'd have said that yesterday before the question came up. Not today, after the questions come up. That's not a valid answer. We don't believe somebody says, oh, I have a tradition about such and such halacha. Don't believe him unless he can prove it. So the Gemara says, no. Shani hachadash shmuel beitinai kayim. Because obviously, the answer is they believed him because the answer is he wouldn't have lied because they could have gone and asked Shmuel. Why didn't they? Probably because he wasn't in the neighborhood. Which presumably they would have sent somebody after the fact to go to Shmuel to check it up. But nonetheless, Kasha, why? We still don't understand why was Doeg's question that said, hey, wait a minute, if that's the case, why isn't it the same thing with Mitzri and all these others? Why is it only in the case of Ammon and Moab we have this different? Here they explained it as called Kavud Melech Penima, because the Torah specifically gives the reason that again, the women were not obligated to bring out food even to the women because women's job is to stay in the home and run the household. That's their job. That's their honor. That's their job. However, in the East, they said, and they said, where is Sarah? And they prove it. Again, Sarah stayed in the tent. That's where she was. That's where we prove it from. Kitanoi. Now, the Gemara says, by the way, it's a machlok kitanoi. That what the reason is. One says because it's a Kabbalah. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, and Rabbi Shimon Omer Al Devar Asher Lo Kitmo Etchem Balachamayim. The reason is not because we have this brush Ammonites Moabites, but because the Torah specifically gives us the rationale that the reason we are not allowed is because they didn't bring us water and bread while we were traveling. Darko Shel Adam Lekadem, since that's the man's job to bring out the food. Therefore, we only exclude the males. And that's where the Gemara ends. Gemara continues with all sorts of other sidebars. But basically, there's a machloket as to whether this is just a halach l'mosh b'sinai, amoniv lo moavit, moavi lo moavit, or it's specifically because the Torah tells us the rationale, and that because that rationale excludes the females, the halacha has to exclude the females. Okay, Rashi gives us, by the way, what is the whole concept of lo yavo? Again, as I said, lo yisa Israelit, they're not allowed to marry into the Jewish nation. Al devar. Now, interestingly enough, if we read, the Torah says the reason why is that they didn't greet us with food and water. So Rashi says, no. Al devar, that's only really a cover up. That's just on the face of its story. The real reason is alo eitza sheyatzu etchem lachtiachem. The real reason Rashi wants to tell us is that they tried to make the Jews sin, as we know in Baal Peor, by tempting the Jews to idolatry and immorality. There is no mention of Ammon in that story. That is exclusively Moab. You're absolutely correct. And we're going to get to that, as if we have enough time, when we get to Ramban, in terms of what there's between Ammon and Moab. Okay. Okay, let's continue. Now, interestingly enough, Rashi says when it says lo t'tayiv adom, we were not allowed to hate the Egyptian legamrei. Hafal picha roy lo l'tavo. You really should hate Edomites. Sheyatza b'charav likvartecha, because when the Jews were traveling from Egypt, it says that Edom doesn't allow the Jews to transit through their land, and it says they come out to the border ready to fight. Lo t'tayiv Mitzri, we should not hate Mitzrim. Hafal picha zarku zechareichem layor. Even though they threw your males into the river, we should not hate the Egyptians. Matam, why? Shahayu lachem achsanya b'shar hadachak. Because when you needed a place to go in the famine, they provided a dwelling place for you. So even though later on they turned against you, nonetheless, because of that, we are not to hate them. However, Rashi says very interestingly, if we compare Ammon and Moab, or Moab only, let's say at this point, to Edom, we see a very interesting comment. Rashi says, Halamadata, this whole parsha comes to teach us, Shamachti lo Adam kasha lo mina harga. A person who tries to cause somebody to sin is worse than somebody who tries to kill you. Somebody who tries to destroy you spiritually is worse than somebody trying to destroy you physically. Why? Person who kills you can only kill you in this world. Somebody who causes you to sin removes you not only from this world, but from the world to come. Therefore, Edom Edom, who wanted to kill them, who was ready to fight against them. Lo nitayev is not to be fully hated. V'chein Mitzrayim, and similarly the Egyptians, even though they drowned them in the river and killed them, nonetheless, we don't fully hate them. They're allowed after 3 generations to convert. The Elul, however, those shechtium that cause them to sin, nitavu, are hated completely. Okay. Now, Ramban is going to try to make some sense of all of this story about what's going on here with the food and what is not. So let's see if we can delve through it. It's a very long Ramban. I hope we'll have time to get through it. But he begins with the following. Matzinu. Now, again, as I went through some of these psukim already. Ochel ba'kesef sashpreni v'ochalti ma'im ha'kesef shitin liv shatiti kasher asuli b'nei Esav ha'yoshvim b'seir ha'moavim ha'yoshvim ba'ar. Now, interestingly enough, Ammon doesn't figure in any of this stuff. There's no mention of Ammon in any of this. Well, they just get, I guess, tarred with the same brush as Ammon, at least according to many opinions. We're going to see a little bit later why Ammon gets the same treatment. But basically, there seems to be a distinction here, because when Moshe is talking to Sichon, he tells he requests that we be allowed to buy food, that they be allowed to sell us food and water, just like the Edomites did and the Moabites did. V'rabim amru shehem lo kadmu etchem, al Yisrael kanu mehem. So the the standard school of thought is, wait a minute, Moshe is saying that they bought food from the Moabites, but the Moabites, at least according to the Pasuk, Hashem expected them to come out and greet them with food. So Hashem lo kadnu otam, avol Yisrael kadnu, but the Jews did buy food from them. The Zehevel, Ramban says that doesn't make any sense. Ki dala machaneh sheyim karu lam kasher yirtzulik knows. It would have been enough for the Jewish people passing through if they'd have sold them food. That should have been enough. The fact is, Ramban seems to imply from this question that the Moabites refused to even provide food for sale. They didn't even not that kidnu etchem doesn't mean that they came out and greeted you with free food. They came out and greeted you by opening the marketplace so you could buy food. Is what Ramban wants to interpret kasher lo kidnu etchem. The ode, and again he goes even further. Ki Yisrael lo bo b'gvul Moav. Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael did not enter into the boundaries of Moab. So why would we have expected Moab to provide food for them? They never passed through Moab. They never hit Moab. They traveled around Moab. So where would Moab had the initiative or attentive to give them food? And the Moabites, at least according to that pasuk, brought them out, at least brought them food that they could buy. So and the pasuk seems to imply from what Moshe says that Moab and Edom did the same exact thing in terms of providing food for the Jews as they were traveling nearby in the desert. Why does the Moabite get this zap treatment and the Edomite gets only a little, treatment? Why? Why the difference? Rabbi Ibn Ezra wants to say that what Moshe really meant was that Esav and Moab gave them permission to actually transit through the land, but they refused to sell them food. They passed through a side road. They passed through the uninhabited portions of Edom and Moab. The Melech of Edom did not allow the Jewish people to travel through inhabited areas. That's all. He said, you want to pass through the desert? Fine, be my guest. You'll all die in the desert. What do I care? Right? He didn't care if they passed through the uninhabited areas, but he wouldn't want no inhabited areas. So obviously they couldn't sell them food because they didn't pass by where any people were living. The who? Ma'ashamar lo tavor bi. That's what Ibn Ezra wants to answer. Ramban says the Gam Zehevel. I don't agree with that. Well, they asked him to pass through the land, and it says directly there, Vayima Ein Edom. This is back in when it really happened. Refused to give them permission. They did not give them any permission to even enter the border. And return, and as David adds, the pasuk there adds, and he's going to say, they did not enter any territory belonging to Edom. So I can't agree with Ibn Ezra's interpretation. In a different pasuk, David, he doesn't quote the one you quote, but he says, after from Har they traveled away toward the Yam Suf, back south to encircle. In other words, they didn't go through Edom, they had to go around Edom. They did not enter the border of Edom. And similarly, the Yiftach Amar reviewer, and Yiftach is talking to the king of Ammon, he's talking about the king of Moab, excuse me. The Yiftach Amar reviewer, when he's explaining why you can't, I'm not coming to fight again, you have your claim to my land is illegitimate. Yiftach says, Ki balotami Mitzrayim vayelach Yisrael b'midbar Yam Suf vayavo Keitshah vayishlach Yisrael malachim emelach Edom limor. He gives the same exact story that we had in parshat Chukat. That's why we read this story as the Haftorah of parshat Chukat. Lo shava melech Edom, gam melech Moab shalach v'lo ava. He also sent the king of Moab, and he didn't allow. So therefore, they went around. We had to go and circle the land of Edom and Moab until we came to the other side of Moab's border, which was Sichon's land. They They did not enter into Moab or into Edom. Rush, which seems to imply directly, as Yiftach says, Moab. The Elul Ba'usham, had they entered into Edom or Moab's territory, then they would have sold them food and bread. Because if you're entering with permission, obviously they're going to let you buy food if you're entering with permission. So clearly that they didn't sell us food because they didn't allow us to enter their land, and they didn't come out across the border and buy and set up food shops for us to buy. So okay. So now, Vanira Lai. So Rambam wants to explain the following. The reason these two brothers, now again, remember I said Ammon and Moab. Remember Ammon hasn't figured in this yet at all, other than he's mentioned in the pasuk. There's no discussion of Ammon throughout all of this. But why does Ammon get linked together with Moab? Because these two brothers, Shehayu Gimulei Chesed Me Avraham, they owed us a debt back from Avram's time. Why? Shehitzil Aviem V'imam Min Acherev Min Hashevi. How many times did Avram save Lot? It was only, firstly, Avram went to war against the four kings to save who? Lot and his family. Okay? When Sodom is destroyed, what does it say? Hashem remembers not Lot and saves him, he remembers Avram. And Lot is saved because of the merit of Avram. So Ammon and Moab, more than anybody else, should have been gracious to the Jews and said, oh, you're coming by our neighborhood? Here, we'll have some food for you. And they should have done something positive for Am Yisrael when they were passing through. Not only did they not do anything good, but they did Ra. Now, the Ra here is only seems to only be directed to Moab, but we're going to see in a minute. Okay, so what is it that they did? Moab is responsible for hiring Bilam. And the other one, who was Ammon, should have, as they were at least near the border of Ammon or crossing right near the border, should have come out and provided food and water for them. Kemoshe Katuv, and how do we know they passed near Ammon? Shato, because it says and you'll come to the territory that's Ammon of Ammon. You're not allowed to bother Ammon. But they did not enter, they did not greet them. Because if that was the case, the Shab should have said that the Ammonites all allowed me to buy food, but they didn't. The Ammonites didn't even set up markets. They kept markets closed, so the Jews could not even buy food as they were passing along the border of Ammon. And Ramban wants to say that Ammon was worse than all of them, even though up till now we've talked about only Moab. Why? When Bnei Esav and Moab realized that the Jews, Hashem had prohibited the Jews from entering into war with them, they brought out and set the food markets up at the border, or right across the border, so the Jews could at least buy food. Even though they didn't allow the Jews to cross the border, they went out from the border and set up food markets. But Ammon didn't even do this. They didn't come out and even provide food and water for them to buy, like Esav and Moab did. So Rambam wants to give a slightly different twist to this whole story, that if we look at the pasuk that gives two different reasons, one of them applies primarily to Ammon, and the other applies primarily to Moab. The one that applies to Ammon is that they didn't come out and provide food for you to buy. The one that applies to Moab is that they went and hired Bilam to try to curse you. So each of these has a reason why we are not to allow converts from them to join us. Because of Ammon should have at least provided us food, therefore they're even worse. That's why the Torah starts with Ammon. We would have thought Ammoni. Why is Ammon singled out first? Because they had the easy job. They should have just all they had to do was come out and provide food like the others did. And then it tells us the Moavi and his sin. So interestingly, we have this whole story, a whole concept here of why each of these nations is prohibited from entering into Eretz Yisrael, into Am Yisrael. And again, as we said, in the case of Ammon and Moab, it only applies to the males, and in all of the cases, other cases, it applies only to the females. Now, interestingly enough, it goes even further. It doesn't say that they're not allowed to convert. It says, "Lo tidro shlomam b'tovatam." You're not even allowed to seek their peace. Okay, midrash b'tovatam miklal shnemer sham. Okay, here, interestingly enough, Ramban says, "Ki melchemet Ammon Moav asra hakatuv aleinu l'dorot." That we, the Jewish people, are never allowed to go to war against Ammon and Moab, because it says, "Al titgarbam eino mitzvah l'shah bilvad." It's not only for that generation, ela mitzvah l'dorot, he mitzvah lo taseh l'dorot. It is an eternal commandment that we never go to war against Ammon and Moab. Shenemar ki livnei lot netatia Yerusha. Because this land, Moshe says at the beginning of the farm, that the land that Ammon and Moab were living was given to them as an inheritance by Hashem. If Hashem has given this to them as their inheritance, it's an eternal inheritance. So therefore, it says that we are not allowed to fight against them forever. If they come to fight against us, we are allowed to fight against those that are coming to attack us in self-defense. And that's why at Yiftach, it specifically mentions all of the places that he goes to fight against. Because these were the cities from which they came to fight against Am Yisrael. They invade Eretz Yisrael. Once they invade Eretz Yisrael, wherever they use as their starting base, and that's where they come from, that we can fight against. And similarly, David fought against Ammon after they had invaded us and fought against them. Once they've invaded us, we don't have to seek their peace. So in such a case, we are allowed to fight against them. But that's the only case that we are allowed to fight against Ammon or Moab. It is in self-defense. And once we begin to find self-defense, we are allowed to actually cross the border and fight against them. Okay. Okay, let's keep going here. One more thing here. B'chor Shara, again, very, very simply says, very simply, why is it that we, again, they didn't come out to greet us. Avram Avinu Gidel Lot Beveito Bitilu Min Hashevi Umilat Lot Hafecha. Look at all these things that Avram did for Lot. He took him along with him. He raised him as even though he was fatherless, and he saved him when he was captured in the war. And he was the reason that Lot was saved from Sodom. V'lodayim shlo kidmo, and it wasn't enough that they didn't come out and greet us, but they also hired Bilam to kalecha. Therefore, we are not allowed to seek their peace and seek their dress. Now, interestingly enough, Adomi says also Shayel Kadem also should have come out to greet us. Shaloach Esav Yaakov, that Yaakov and Esav are brothers. But again, we're not allowed to, because since he is our brother and since he's a son of Avram and Yitzchak, nonetheless, we still have this obligation. Okay. I think we're going to have to stop here because we are basically out of time. But again, I think the point that the Parshanim want to make very simply is twofold. Number one, that we have to understand that this whole mitzvah relates back to the history of these nations, our history in passing through them. And primarily, it's a question really of Hakarat HaTov, that if we understand that the rationale that the Torah expected these sons of Lot, these nations that are descended from Lot, to have favorable feelings, to recognize the fact that we Am Yisrael, or our ancestor Avram, is the reason that these nations existed, and to be nice to us, not to go out of their way to antagonize us. And that concept, that lack of hakarat hatov, is the reason that Ammonites and Moabites seemingly are excluded. And that, I think, is why the story of Ruth, who is the first Moabite to come and want to convert, is specifically exactly the opposite. It shows somebody who was makir tov, somebody that Ruth shows her gratitude to her mother-in-law and travels with her, and rather than saying, "Oh, I don't have anything to do with you," and that is why she is able to be the trendsetter in terms of showing us how you are supposed to be makir tov, how you're supposed to say thanks for somebody, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu is makir tov to her and rewards her for her efforts toward Naomi, and I think that really is the whole lesson of this whole episode of Ammon and Moab, the entire story going all the way back, as I said, to Avram, to Lot, to his daughters, to all of this is really the matter of when we acknowledge that what we have is we thank others, then we can acknowledge Hashem. But if we can't thank others for what they've given us, how can we ever acknowledge Hashem for what He has given us? That's why Hakarat Tov is seen as such an important value in the Torah, acknowledging people when they do good for us, even with a very simple, just simply saying thank you. Wow, you did me a favor. I appreciate it. And if we do that and we teach the world that that's the only thing we teach the world, we will make the world a lot better place, and we can ultimately come to Hashem and say, Hashem, we've tried our best, and we hope that as I said, as we now are beginning to get near and closer to the Yom Noraim. We're in the month of Elul, as this parsha is always read among those that are read in Elul. We are already looking forward and thinking about the fact that we're going to be coming before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and asking Him to be makir tov, to be gracious to us. So therefore, we have to be gracious to others as we prepare for the Yom Noraim, and we hope that Hashem should hear our tefillot and pray and bless all of us and all of Am Yisrael and all of the world with a year of blessing, a year of peace, a year that we will perhaps see the world go in a different direction and start going a little bit more positive direction toward awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and K'nizocha to Gula Shlem Meher V'Yameinu. Thank you all. I open up now for questions, comments, feedback. Gershon, you got a question?
The beginning mentioned the Mitzrayim also.
Yes, the beginning it mentions the Egyptians.
Well, how does that reconcile with the Arab law?
How does that reconcile with the Erev Rav, who are all Egyptians, is Gershon's question. First and foremost, this concept of, there's nothing that says the Erev Rav were all Egyptians. Erev Rav, by definition, means a group of people who came from all different nations. Primarily, I would suspect that they primarily were non-Egyptian. They were primarily political or prisoners in Egypt or slaves in Egypt who said, oh, the Egyptian Empire is crumbling. We got a chance to get out of here. Let's get out of here. So they were probably mostly non-Egyptian. On the other hand, even if they were Egyptian, this halacha is only post Matan Torah. So I guess they got in under the grandfather clause and they made it in before Mitzrayim were excluded from converting. Again, on the other hand, there's a whole big question about whether the Erev Rav, whether they actually properly convert or not. That's a whole discussion for another whole time. Okay? They are only correct. The Erev Rav is mentioned once. The Erev Rav Eloi Tam Mitzonu Bakar Mikneh Kaved Mod. An Erev Rav, some group of which we seem to imply is some group of people left with them. And that's the only time they're mentioned by name as the Erev Rav. Every other time they're Parshanim and Midrashim want to say, oh, there are times when it says it's referring to the Erev Rav. You're right. We don't really know what happened to them. They may have just left Egypt, and as soon as they got across the Yam Suf, they went back to wherever home was. Or they may have stayed. We don't know. We have no idea what happened to the Erev Rav. Okay, so that's a whole great question for a whole different shiur. The parallel between Mitzrayim and Germany. Ooh. Wait, you're talking about 20th century Nazi Germany. Okay. Poland is probably better. Yeah. Yes. Yes, 16th century, 17th century even. Yes.
But the fact is, you know, and now generation the whole group. No, I mean it's an interesting. Three generations seems about right.
Okay,
because,
three.
The people who've grown up, they're not necessarily the same people.
Yes, yeah. David's question is can we kill? But first of all, we have to understand that there's three generations. This is a discussion among the Parshanim. Is the three generations an absolute three generations from Moshe's time, and that's it, and then it never applies again? Or is it three generations for each Egyptian who wants to convert 5 generations later, 10 generations later? That's a machloket among the Parshanim. But again, the question of 3 generations, how long does it take to forgive somebody or a nation? That's a great question. Human history, unfortunately, is very, very short. Human memory is very, very short. We forget things. On the other hand, human memory is very long. There's it depends on whether what perspective. I mean, the example I give is I remember when 9/11 happened and everybody was, oh my God, it was up in arms. We got to get, within a couple of years that it was all forgotten. Whereas a Holocaust is something you can't forget. Egyptian slavery is something we are told we can never forget. So but does that mean we hold Egypt today responsible for the Egyptian slavery? No, it's not the same Egyptians. They've long since left the face of the earth and disappeared and been integrated, and who knows who lives in Egypt today. So that it's because it's different because Egypt is a geographic location. When we say that we were enslaved to Paro, it's a very different thing than saying we were slaves in Egypt. You see, Egypt is a geographic location. But nonetheless, the Torah tells us we're not supposed to return to Egypt. Okay, the geographic location, regardless of who's living there. Is it the same with Germany? I don't know. That's interesting. It's an interesting parallel. Yes. Yes, accepting confession money or whatever you want to call it, guilt money, blood money. Yeah.
Can you repeat his question, please?
David's comment is he's saying that trying to compare Egypt to Nazi Germany and the question of paying how we the Jewish state viewed our relationship with Germany, let's say in the 1950s when there was the first discussion of possible financial repayment for some of the atrocities of the Holocaust to survivors versus the way we might feel about that today. That's David's comment, and can we draw a parallel to that to the 3 generations that the Torah prescribes for Egyptians having to wait to convert? I don't know. As I said, I think the book is out on that as to how we treat systemic anti-Semitism, or in the case of as I said, in the case of Germany, it's more than just systemic anti-Semitism. But if I go back to the Torah, as I go back to Rashi's comment, the Germans were clearly bent on just killing Jews. They didn't care whether you were observant, non-observant. They were just bent on killing you. So from Rashi's perspective, they weren't as bad as, per se, the church, whose entire goal for 2 millennia was to convert Jews, to pull them away from Judaism. And if you didn't want to convert, well, then we'll kill you. But their primary goal was to convert Jews. So, for example, if I say the Spanish Inquisition, where the goal was to convert Jews rather than kill Jews, I would say that the 3 generations doesn't apply. Whereas, in the case of Germany, maybe the 3 generations does apply. But again, that's, you see, you also have to assume that the 3 generation means that they've forsaken the mentality of their ancestors. So I'm not so sure that's true. I'm sure, yes, there are Germans who regret it, who might be very nice people, but if suddenly a Hitler rose to power again and it was the in thing to do, I'm sure that there are a lot of people who are sitting on the fence who would be equally swayed just like they were back then. Oh, it's definitely not. No, there's no way the Germans alone without the complicity of the Polish. And I will say this on record, and I'll never visit Poland because I'm a fugitive. I'm a wanted criminal now in Poland. But the fact of the matter is, they had plenty of Polish citizens who helped. There were Polish citizens who helped Jews, but unfortunately, there were Polish citizens who helped the Nazis. There were all Ukrainians and Russians and Lats and Estonians who helped Jews. There were those who did nothing and just stood by and watched with twiddled their thumbs, and there were those who were out there helping the Germans pull the triggers. So there in each country, and certainly in Eastern Europe, and I'm sure to a lesser extent in Western Europe, with the exception, I think, of the Danes, that there were those that helped, and there were those that helped on both sides. There were those that helped exterminate Jews, and there were those that helped save Jews. So that's, but that's human nature, that, you can't generalize. There are people who will go against the trend and will realize that this is wrong. And there are those that will say, well, everybody else is doing it, so I'm just following orders. Anyway, any other questions or comments? All right, thank you all. Have a good evening. Have a good rest of the week. And Be'ez Hashem, we'll see you all next week.